Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Black Migrants in Europe. Law Enforcement, Identity, and Politics. This side event is organized by the International Service for Human Rights, as well as the UN Antiracism Coalition, UNARC. The event is also co-sponsored by various coalition members: Race and Equality, Temblores, Refugees in Libya, Aquarius Survivors, el equipo de implementación del diseño en España, Ulster University, and Don't Hit La Negrex Collective. My name is Lamar Bailey Karamañites. I am the coalition coordinator for UNARC, and I am based in Spain, where I am also a Black migrant in Europe. A report recently published by the International Independent Expert Mechanism to Advance Racial Justice and Equality in the Context of Law Enforcement mentioned that in France, people perceived as migrants were disproportionately affected by police misconduct. This report also highlights that people living in the indivisible intersection between migration status, nationality, race, or ethnicity are victims of racial profiling. The report by the OACHR that will be presented later today mentions that violence experienced by Africans and Afro-descendant migrants in France, Cyprus, the UK, Spain, Germany, and many other European countries. And this is highlighted in this report. We know from experience, and this is also highlighted in these reports that I mentioned, that I just mentioned, that police violence in the context of law enforcement is a systemic problem, and not a problem of some few bad apples. But what does it mean to be perceived as a migrant? What does it look like when you live in this indivisible intersection of race, nationality, and gender? If we open the space for participation, what solutions are given by directly impacted people? Today, we will hear from Iki Yos, Moses Van Kallon, and David Yambio. They are directly impacted people. Later then, we will hear from Dr. Tracie Keesee from EMLER, and also Mr. Abdoul Thioye from the OHCHR for such a powerful statement. Next, we will hear from Mr. Moses Van Kallon. He's the president of Aquarius Survivors.
Hello, good afternoon or good morning. First of all, I want you all to realize that nobody was born to be an immigrant or refugee in another man's land. We are all born freely and to live freely, just like anybody else. But many things happen why people immigrate to other countries. Some of these things, we can talk about war, climate change, natural disaster, exploitation of natural resources, etc. I will not talk too much. I just want to highlight the little things that make us to immigrate in Europe. Some of us, our country, have been in war for decades. Like the country I came from, Sierra Leone, we have been in war for 11 years. After the rebel war, we have political crisis and economic crisis. These are some reasons why people migrate to find a better life. Climate change is a natural disaster that nobody hoped for and nobody prays for. If you look about 2 weeks or last month, a month ago, what happened in Morocco, Libya, over 2,000 people are displaced, 2,000 are dead. Where are those people going who are displaced? They have to move to another city, another place to have a comfortable life. That has never been their wish, but is a natural disaster. So we don't know if there is a mechanism in place for those people to live happily and to have a better life, but they keep migrating from one place to another just because of that natural disaster. Now let's come to exploitation of natural resources in Africa. some of our land have been polluted. For what? For finding of mineral resources, exploitation of our timber goals, exploitation of our lands. Now, most of this land do not belong to the political parties. This land belongs to the poor people. And when this land are being taken from them, they have to find a place to stay. They cannot live on the streets. This thing provoke migration, and many of us have to move to find a better life. Now, when we move, we die in the desert just to look for a better life. We become prisoners in Libya just to look for a better life. And we become hostage in the Mediterranean Sea just to find a better life. Nobody wants to open their borders for us to enter. It has never been our fault to move from one country to another. We are all born freely, and we deserve a better life. Now, as long as there is an exploitation of natural resources in Africa, there will be an immigration. If the exploitation stops, I believe immigration will stop. Because the poor people have been used and have been forgotten, while the rich people keep enjoying and exploiting their lives. We, the poor people, have to run and find an education, a better life, and a good health. But once we find the sea, the Mediterranean Sea, has a border, nobody wants to rescue us. Every country closes their borders. They rescue us, they put us in prison. They don't give up documents. Now, I will go back to that place. I will touch that one again. But let me just highlight most of the things that provoke people to come to Europe, to immigrate. The other is sexual equality. Sexual equality. The EU or the European Union has a law of sexual equality, for example, homosexualism and lesbianism, that everybody has right to practice his or her sexual right. In Africa, most of us don't have that right to practice because of our cultural reasons. So what are we going to do? We run for our lives, and we find a safety place where we can use where we can practice our sexualism with our freedom and with our rights. But what happened? We are rejected to enter into Europe because they think we are criminals, or we are tourist people who want to cause problems in Europe, or we want to come to Europe to take their jobs and take their money, take what? Which is wrong. If European Union, as they are telling Africa to accept homosexualism, which is our right, which is the right of every person to practice his sexual right. But when the person is persecuted, running for his life or her life, the European Union closed their borders. What happened? Some of them take this person and return it back to the country of victim, which is very wrong. So if you are imposing this law in Africa, and the African culture is not accepting it, and the people they are living want to express their freedom of sexuality, and you are closing your border and don't allow them to enter, what is the message you are sending to us in Africa? That we should stay there and die. It's very painful that I saw my brothers and sisters die in front of me in Libya, seeing them die in the Mediterranean Sea, that I cannot do anything. I was also fighting for my life. You know, nobody was born like that, and nobody deserves those kind of treatment. Nobody deserves to die that kind of way. I don't have much of time. Let's come back to Europe. After crossing the Mediterranean Sea, there are a lot of limitations to our part. Limitation to education. We have been discriminated. Is it because of our color or our culture? we have been discriminated because of the language barriers, because I've never spoken Spanish in my country. But when I came to Spain, I have to learn Spanish to get in what I want to integrate. You know, after everything I've been through in Libya, my brain, my head cannot allow me to adapt to the system quickly because of the torture and the trauma I was being through. But I forced myself to be among the people who want to push Spain, who want to contribute to the development of Spain. But we are being discriminated by not giving us documents. We live in the streets, lack of inclusion. All I want to say is that we are all humans and we deserve a better treatment. And nobody was born to be an immigrant or refugee in another man's land. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Moses. Now we will hear from David Yambio. David is a community advocate and spokesperson at the NGO Refugees in Libya.
Thank you so much for your valuable time to come and listen to us. It is very hard to speak something meaningful after listening to my fellow fighters, but I'm truly inspired by what they had to go through, Moses, Iki, and us here in Europe. But we are sitting here today in Europe to talk about not only about law enforcement within European borders, or our identity, or the politics. It is why I will take you back to the countries of origin. If there are African heads of state here who are cooperating with the European counterparts, they are also need to be held accountable on several scenarios. Bear in mind that today we will share some graphic pictures in which we have the right and consent from the victims or relatives, and also as the acting guardians to the people that have had to lose their lives while on the move. I come from South Sudan, and I was born in 1997 in an internally displaced camp because during that period my country was severely ruined in war. During this time, when I was only 2 months old, my family were forced to flee to Congo, and the following year, we sought refuge in Central African Republic, where we lived with limited access to education and resources as refugees. In 2005, a comprehensive peace agreement was signed between the warring party of Sudan, and then the people in the neighboring country had to return. And together with them, I returned and I started to go to school at the age of 8 for the first time. But this dream only died out because in 2009, I was kidnapped by the rebel groups of Joseph Kony, known as the RLA, the Rhodes Resistance Army, that were fighting in Uganda and Congo and South Sudan. I was put as a child soldier to fight in the neighboring countries until the following year, which I survived in 2010, and I returned to my community. Again, at this path, in 2011, when the country divided, we thought and we found peace. We started to build our own community. But again, this dream never truly existed because in 2013, another civil war started, at which my own government, at the age of 16, forcibly conscripted me, along with many other children, to fight in the army, which is to say, my country and the war that we have been fighting, it has been fought by children forcibly conscripted and kidnapped from their families. At this point in 2016, I decided to become a refugee. Oftentimes, people don't have the choices, but ahead of me, I had choices to continue killing alongside my government, to become a militia, to become a nobody, to commit suicide in my own society. But I decided to become a refugee, and I left my country. That was when I went to the Republic of Chad, and I sought refuge there, living under inhuman conditions, because oftentimes I had to survive at the mercy of charity organizations. This did not stop my search for a dignified life as everyone. I proceeded to the Republic of Libya, in 2018, but upon my arrival there, my time was marked by torture, exploitation, slave labor, arbitrary detention, kidnappings. In early 2019, I attempted to cross the Mediterranean because it was the only way for salvation, as I thought. But I was forcibly intercepted on the Mediterranean, pulled back to Libya, and I was put in an indefinite and systematic detention, which was under the agreement between Italy and the European countries, and then Libya. I suffered not only that as I tried to make another attempt, but again, in November that year, I was again sent back to Libya, forcibly conscripted by the Rada militias inside Libya to fight in the Libyan war. This did not stop there. I made the third attempt, the fourth attempt. I was also rejected, and I was sent back to all these circles. I was put in 4 years. I was imprisoned 17 times for my own identity. But this did not end there, because I'm sitting here today as a testament to our own resilience, to the violence and humiliations that migrants, refugees, people on the move have endured as a result of political negligence to our own existence. In 2021, the neighborhood Gregaris was under attack. It was a home to 10,000 of people. People were rounded up and put in detention center. That was when we decided to say no. We formed the self-organized protest movement, Refugees in Libya, which I am representing here today, to speak for the people, to demand our rights. And it is when we speak about identity, the identity that resolutions, the agreements that are drawn here are not able to understand and design. It is when I try to share a story of the people that I have been in touch with that lose their life. Pato, that I'm going to show here, is a family man that fled his country from Cameroon in 2016, and he arrived to Libya. In Libya, he was exploited also, subjected to the same humiliation that I was explaining, the same scenarios that I went through. But in Libya, he came in contact with a woman from Ivory Coast, and they together made a family, because they couldn't succeed in crossing the Mediterranean, which they tried 5 times and were sent back to Libya. They gave birth to a new daughter, and living in Libya since all these years with no right to access education, to access public service, to access jobs, they decided a few months ago to go to Tunisia with the hope to register their daughter in school. But reaching the Tunisian territory, they were expelled and pushed back to Libya, and they were dumped in the desert, where, if we are to see this picture, the woman named Fatidoso and Marie, her 6-year-old daughter, were left in the desert, and they died and they lost their lives there. This is not the only story that we have followed. It means that we, with all these experiences in our identity, we have acted as solidarity among ourselves. We have acted as solution that the authority have not been able to provide to us. We have acted as journalists to document what we have experienced at borders and within the European territories. Coming back to politics and representation, we talk about countries where I found asylum today in Italy, which is creating a new decree which asks asylum seekers that had to endanger their life on the Mediterranean to reach the Italian territory to pay approximately 5,000 euros as an alternative to detention center. These are things and these are decrees and laws that we found unacceptable. These are decrees and laws that marginalize more than what we have experienced already. And at this point, we have several demands to make to the states to humanize our existence, to humanize the policies that they make, and to also to recognize our experiences from countries of origin and then in transit. Thank you.
And move closer to a more just and inclusive world. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Keesee. Now we will hear from Mr. Abdoul Thioye, the Chief of the Rule of Law, Equality and Non-Discrimination Branch of the OHCHR.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you to the UN Antiracism Coalition for organizing this event. And thank you also to all the panelists for your informative intervention. I would say, perfect excellence. My colleagues and I have been listening carefully. Already in 2001, in the Durban Declaration and Program of Action, states acknowledge that migrants and refugees are among the victims of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance, and provided a set of concrete recommendations to ensure the full enjoyment by all migrants of all human rights. And yet, across the world, African migrant of African descent, and refugees and asylum seekers continue to face different forms of discrimination, racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance. What we have heard today echoes reports of the discriminatory treatment and disparate impact of migration policies on African migrants and migrants of African descent. The High Commission and UN Human Rights Mechanism have highlighted legislation adopted by some states and increasingly restrictive policies and controls at international borders that have resulted in measures and practices that restrict the human rights of migrants and save pathways for regular migration. This has a disproportionate impact on African and people of African descent. They have repeatedly highlighted alleged human rights violations involving excessive use of force, loss of life, arbitrary detentions, unlawful deportations, and a lack of legal safeguard. They have raised concerns about the situation of African migrant, domestic workers, especially women, and the increasing use of new technology tools in border and immigration enforcement context in ways that are discriminatory or that deepen racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance. Harmful narratives, measures, or laws which directly or indirectly associate migrants with crises, problems, or security threats have increasingly permeated politics, the media, and public discourse. Such narratives hamper migrants' ability to enjoy their human rights and may lead to discrimination and violence. They enable, exacerbate, and perpetuate harmful stereotypes, the criminalization and securitization of migration, and discriminatory structures, laws, policies, and practices, including in the context of law enforcement. And they have far-reaching impacts on our societies, normalizing hate-fueled ideas and language, and weakening those social fabric. Indeed, African migrant and migrant of African descent stand at the crossroads of intersectionality and inequality, facing multiple forms of discrimination arising from their racial and ethnic origin and their migration status, as well as other factors such as sex, gender identity, sexual orientation, disability, religion, socioeconomic, and other stages. As we mark the 75th anniversary of the milestone Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the High Commission has made a strong call on states to accelerate the pace of action. This entails implementing obligation under the International Convention on the Elimination of all forms of racial discrimination and other international human rights treaties, as well as details, recommendations by UN Human Rights Mechanism issued in general, recommendations and thematic reports and following country visits or reviews. It also entails implementing recommendations in the High Commissioner's agenda towards transformative change for racial justice and equality, notably with regard to actions by law enforcement and to confronting the legacies of enslavement and colonialism. It also means taking concrete measures to translate commitments made through the Global Compact for Migration and its Progress Declaration to eliminate racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia and relative intolerance, stigmatization, hate speech, and hate crimes, as well as negative stereotyping and misleading narratives that generate harmful perceptions of migrant and migration. More generally, we all have a role to play in standing up against racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance. It is critical to shift narratives of fear, hate, and division to those that uphold everyone's human dignity and human rights without any kind of discrimination. In the framework of OHHR's Stand Up for Migrants, the office has developed a toolbox to offer guidance on how to shift the narratives on migration from hate and exclusion to celebrating what we have in common and painting a hopeful picture of the future we share. As the High Commissioner has highlighted, I quote, "The time for action is now," end of quote. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Thioye. Right now we will open the floor to questions. If anyone has a question, something you want to explain, this is the moment. Great, thanks.
Can you, for Moses, can you give us an update on the Aquarius survivors and the promises made by the Spanish government?
Well, Aquarius Survivors, when the boats arrived in 2018 in Spain, there was a lot of promise, a lot of expectation from the Spanish government. At the moment, there are many people living without documentation who arrived in that boat in 2018 and don't have access to medication and proper medication. So it's very hard and it was very tough that the government make it a statement until now. He has not fulfilled his promise to us. We have been calling the government of Spain at least to see us and we can to know what is our situation, but until now they never listen to us and never pick our calls.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dave. I don't know if anyone else wants to add to that answer.
I think if we are talking about documentation, which is a crucial point of identity as we see, because for us here in Europe, it means that our lives are defined by pieces of paper. If you don't have, you're dumped in concentration camps, in accommodation center, as they call it. With my experience in Italy as a country that is at the front line receiving people, just a few weeks ago I was in Lampedusa, and most of the arrivals from Tunisia, from Libya, from all the affected countries arrived autonomously to the island, and some were rescued by the Italian Coast Guards. The people who were rescued, they are then brought to shores, and they are now put into prisons, as I can call it, because there is this new legislation that I was talking about with finding body, because there is something that we cannot endure, circumstances that is beyond our human endurance, that push us from Sudan to take all these transit countries until arriving in Libya, and then Tunisia, then in Europe here where we are not wanted, because the politics, the system, the mechanisms, the designs is only institutional, an evident racism, because I cannot just mention what is the difference between the receptions of Ukrainians and the people that arrive on the Mediterranean. So there is value added in that, and we want it to continue.
Thank you, sir, for that proposal. I believe it's very, very important, not only on the sea, but also on the border like Libya. A lot of people are losing their lives. I believe last year we have a massive people who died here, and we don't know how the situation is for their families back home. What are the inquiries going on to know who died, and what is the process going on? Because those people are not chickens; they are human beings. So they deserve better information. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Moses, and to all of the panelists, thank you so much for participating. Unfortunately, we are out of time. We want to thank all the stakeholders, the states, UN representatives, and directly impacted people for joining us today. To the states, we thank you for coming, and it is our most sincere hope that you become an ally in the fight against systemic racism, and also to the UN representatives. We want to echo, before we go, the OHCHR recommendations to states to implement the agenda towards transformative change. In this respect, the experiences of Black communities must be centered. And last but not least, we also want to echo EMLER's recommendation to support community-based alternatives to law enforcement. Thank you for coming.